Hey everybody, Jason Sheftel here, and it's time now to talk about warfare. Again, it's warfare, and this time it is war in the skies. We need to talk about what the program the US military is calling Next Generation Air Dominance, or NGAD. So this is a very big deal, and it relates to the F-35 video I put out, and it's really important when you have potential military conflicts in Ukraine, all around the world really. And then, of course, near China and around Taiwan, where every day and every month China is pushing more and more planes into Taiwanese airspace, and it is creating a threatening atmosphere like people haven't seen in a very long time. So what is the US military doing about this, right? So a very big program is called Next Generation Air Dominance, the NGAD program. There's actually two of these programs. One is for the Navy, but the one we're going to focus on primarily is for the Air Force. This is an Air Force program to build the successors to the F-22 and the F-35. These are the premier tactical fighter jets of the US military at this point in time. But what people don't quite realize is that even though these planes seem new and advanced, they're pretty old. The F-22 was conceived and really got started in the late 1980s. So that's a long, long time ago, right? That's 40 years ago. Basically at this point, when you look at the F-35, that was really started in the late 90s. This is really when it got going. So we're looking at programs that are decades old. So the thing that everybody is trying to figure out is, what do we need next? What needs to be built? And obviously, what do we need? What should be built? All of this is very controversial for people who aren't focused or thinking that much about security matters, but it is very important for the military, also for all US sort of partners and allies, in particularly in East Asia, where the Chinese military buildup is a massive threat to everything they know, right? If things go south. So this is what we're going to talk about today. It's just a bit about this Next Generation Air Dominance program because it's very important. The key problem is that the F-22 and F-35 are just not enough to get the job done against China. So I spoke about the F-35 in particular in another video people can check out, but the gist of it is that it doesn't have the legs, it doesn't have the armament, and it isn't really what the military needs. A lot of war games show that basically the F-35 will only be useful around 2030 when it gets a full suite of coming upgrades that are coming to both the hardware and the software of the plane. One of the problems with this plane is that it isn't exactly very easy to update, and the development cycles are so long now that it has just basically made itself obsolete in a lot of ways. A lot of the actual really advanced sensor fusion, great elements of the F-35 are actually so old now that they're being all replaced. Even though the marketing and everything is still there, the truth is they have to replace all these subsystems, and they're trying to do this in very interesting ways and make it the whole thing much better, but that's really not the point. The point is that this F-35 isn't exactly what the military needs, and the F-22 is old and out of production. And it's a big problem. The F-22, if it had still had a production line, you could have updated the plane as more planes were produced. You would have had a whole repair program. You would have had all this sort of stuff, but that didn't happen. So both of these planes are on the way out and something else is needed, and that is what this Next Generation Air Dominance program is about. And there's a lot of speculation about it, a lot of interest in it, and so we're going to just cover a bit of that because this really matters, and the success of this program will really determine what happens for the composition of basically the U.S. Air Force's entire inventory in a lot of ways, because the success, the speed at which this is all developed will really matter in all sorts of budgeting and force planning for decades to come. So it's very important. So let's talk about it. This is not unlike those other programs, the F-22, the F-35. This is not a single program. This is almost certainly a family of systems, right? This isn't one plane, it's multiple planes. And it's not multiple planes in the same way the F-35 was 3 planes. It is a different style, and what they're looking for is a family of systems that can do reconnaissance and targeting and surveillance and coordinated assault. And some of the key differentiating features of the NGAD is most likely its ability to be part of a very distributed suite of weapons platforms and sensors, right? Basically, sensors and shooters is some of the terminology used in the military circles around this, and the idea is that you can have fully networked war, AI fusion, or you end up eventually, you start talking about this, you just end up in so many buzzwords, especially when you have a program that's sort of still behind the scenes, you don't actually know. But the very key difference, and the important thing here is that first, the NGAD is different from the F-22 and F-35, because the F-35 has this whole sensor fusion thing, but it isn't quite as distributed and lethal as the military needs. It also isn't as stealthy as the military needs, and it is not, again, an air superiority, air dominance, right, sort of fighter. To actually do a lot of the air superiority missions, you don't want that plane. You don't want the F-35, and the F-22, which is meant for that role, is old, and it's at the point now where just creating a pure air superiority fighter on its own in a single program really wouldn't make much sense. The F-22 is actually going to be almost certainly phased out because it is so limited in what it can do. The F-35 can at least do ground attack. It can be very useful, and the entire tactical fleet for militaries around the world is really shifting towards multi-role fighters that can really just do useful things when they're not fighting to take over the skies in the air dominance context or the air superiority context. And that's the real problem with the F-22, is it hasn't actually ever been able to do much. So you want platforms that are more multi-role, or you want a system that can work together that can be useful throughout a battle space, right? You don't just want the air superiority dogfighting sort of thing the F-22 does. You want something much closer to, well, air dominance, a complete networked, integrated attempt to get air dominance, and that is what the NGAD program is about. And this is a very, very key program for the U.S. industrial base. And I focus on this, and a lot of people now focus on this because since the late 80s, 90s, basically the end of the Cold War, and the beginning of the mass era of globalization that we know, the U.S. industrial base, and particularly the defense industrial base, has heavily consolidated. So just in the aviation space, I mean, 50 years ago, there were 10 major U.S. manufacturers that were capable of producing jets. Now there's 3, right? So this post-Cold War consolidation was big, and at the current moment, it is actually causing a lot of problems. So throughout the military, throughout policy circles, there's an intense, keen focus on the U.S. industrial base and whether certain programs will help it, will harm it, or will do damage. So a big problem with the F-35 was that it gave the final authority and ultimate contract to one company for 3 different planes functionally. It gave Lockheed Martin the basically sole control over the U.S. tactical fighter air wing, right? It was a really crazy thing. So instead of having multiple companies making multiple planes, 14s, 15s, 16s, et cetera, all, from different companies, you had one company making everything. It was actually very bad. It's bad for the cost consciousness of that company. There's no competition. It's bad for the later sustainment and operational costs where, again, you don't have one company competing against other companies. You also don't have one plane competing against other planes. This is a huge problem. It's part of the reason, among other reasons, that the U.S. military has brought in the F-15EX as a sort of modernized, updated version of the old F-15 to do some of the roles and take some of the place of some old F-15s and to actually reduce the number of F-35s and to bring some sort of cost consciousness and awareness of competition to this whole program, which has been really crazy, really expensive, and it is the most expensive weapons program basically in U.S. history. And the whole Next Generation Air Dominance program or initiative is being done in light of the F-35. And it's really hard to overestimate how much the F-35 has just sucked up the bandwidth of the U.S. military for a really long time. And as I said in the headline to this live stream, the F-35 is not very useful against China. It's not like a bad thing to have, but it is also not decisive. And that's a really key thing, because what the U.S. needs as the overmatch capacity, as the technological military balance between the U.S. and China has gradually evened out, it needs to regain that decisive edge, and the F-35 does not do that. So at this point, I think a key U.S. military official, a U.S. Air Force official said, if China isn't scared of it, why are we doing it, right? That is sort of a key motivating thought that's really present throughout the U.S. military right now. And the F-35 is a huge challenge to it. And it's not just the F-35 as the plane is. It is, like I said, the whole program, the whole way it was executed, and particularly the large timelines and the fact that functionally, even though it was first flown late 90s, early 2000s, we're looking at 2030 before it's in the final phase that everybody in the military wants it to be in. That is way too long. So the Next Generation Air Dominance program is trying to do many things to overcome these challenges and to learn from the F-35 program, both the plane itself and to make it more effective and make a successor that is more effective and more useful and more capable, but also the entire development process. So this program is going to be a key challenge for many of the really dominant trends in high-end manufacturing, particularly aviation manufacturing right now. So this program is supposed to use a lot of digital engineering. So that means having basically digital twins of the specific aircraft that you're making, right? So you have a full 3D, totally comprehensive, even augmented reality viewable model of the plane you're building. This is really important. And so one place that people might have seen this recently is with the James Webb Space Telescope, where not only did they actually have a digital twin, they also had a legit, like, complete twin of the actual spacecraft that they had on the ground. And they were testing all sorts of things on the actual one in the lab, basically, before they actually did anything on the actual system that was in space by that point. That is a huge thing. And to do that on a digital level, where you actually can adjust the model on the fly, it's more flexible, it's more adaptable, it's very useful in production. When you're actually making the plane, you can have a visual look at exactly how every single thing is supposed to happen, how this fastener is supposed to go in, how this coating is supposed to be applied, what it's supposed to look like, if the thickness of a certain part is precisely what it's supposed to be. This allows for a lot of precision. It allows for a lot of awareness of the entire process, a lot of control, and also a lot of flexibility. It's a really, really major thing. And it's moving everywhere in not only aircraft manufacturing, but manufacturing in general. It's something that's really been enabled by the increases in computing and visualization powers that we've been afforded recently. So that's one thing. Another big one is also more of a agile software development mindset and framework from the beginning. So agile software is basically, and spiral development, all this stuff is basically a style of systems engineering where you are sort of spiraling up. You're basically building out features and updating systems rapidly, and you are sort of bringing up the updates as they are available, and you're making it so the whole thing still functions and can be rapidly updatable without having to do these massive sort of block updates to everything, which are slower, and the entire development style is very different. So this is a style of programming and development that is really common in Silicon Valley. It's common for tech companies that are trying to develop, launch, and iterate on projects and products really, really quickly, right? That is what you want. And some of that agility, right? This is the great word. Some of that agility, both in terms of the flexible side-to-side motion to shift and adapt and to avoid things and to stretch your hand forward to get something done, grab something, move forward. Anyway, that whole metaphor, agility, trying to bring agility into the software side of things, huge, very huge. This is the complete opposite of, let's say, the F-35 program. Well, F-22 is just actually so old that the software updatability and forward proofing is just so weak that that's one reason that the plane is probably not going to last all that much longer. It can't even be updated super well. But the F-35 is just from a different era where it just takes so long to do these updates. Every single part of the plane sort of has to be debugged and checked before you can get sort of one small update in. And that's a huge problem. That relates to another big next generation air dominance change, which is an open systems architecture from the beginning. This is also really, really big. It's another problem that was crystallized in the F-35 program, where let's say you have 20 different subsystems in a plane. Now the U.S. military wants, and what's also just better in general, is to have each of these systems be something that you can get from various manufacturers, something that could be sort of plug and play, something that could be updated and replaced on a both software and hardware level without destroying the whole plane, without requiring the entire thing to go through very complex integration testing. You don't want to be doing very complex multi-system integration testing every time you update a plane. And you also want to have the flexibility to swap in or out different subsystems, different controllers, different capacities, basically, as they're available. And as old things obsolesce, you want to be able to bring in new components. This is just a really big, almost basic thing. I mean, one way to think about it is a desktop computer where you have your RAM, you have your CPU, you have your GPU, you have all these different pieces. And you can, if you're one of those people that likes to do this or has done it before, you could just plug and play. You can get a new graphics card. You can get some cooling. You can do this. You can pop open the thing, pop open the chassis, replace something, and do it something like that. Obviously, a plane is not the same thing. An advanced military jet is not that simple, but the philosophy and having that embedded in the systems is actually extraordinarily important and can add a lot of benefits. That's actually one thing that, again, by 2030, they want the F-35 program to have, or the F-35 plane, basically to have shifted to something closer to this. One component, some of the components of this big Block 4 upgrade, which I've been referencing, which is supposed to come together around 2030 and make the F-35 the plane that everybody was hoping it would be, and which is a good thing and actually is going to become that, but also it isn't the plane you need for China in particular, as I mentioned earlier, but it's still enormously important. This Block 4 update is a hardware and a software update, and on the hardware side, it's finally putting in new components. Like I said, some of the stuff that was originally in there is just old. You're replacing it. It's also software updates, but the key thing, a key part of it is basically moving it in general towards more of an open system, right? Because as you're updating the actual hardware and the software, you're starting to get to a place where you can make it less of a system that has to be totally integration tested all the time and stuff like that. So that's basically a really important thing that's happening. And this next generation air dominance is supposed to do that more from the start and not on the back end where it's extremely hard and time consuming and costly to do. So that is a big part of it. And another final key part of this next generation air dominance program is much more rapid production. So like I said, the F-35 is only just now getting into really its production stride. It's going to be producing about 150 planes for a really long time. And that's, well, for years and years. And that's a lot of planes. That's way more planes than most countries ever build. And it's really important because right now there's maybe 750-ish of these jets. And then in the next 5 years, you're going to have another 750 be produced. That's a really big change. That's a doubling of the total inventory. Very big thing. But the time it took to get to this scale of production and this speed of production is insane. It took so long. There were so many problems. The military is really trying to do something different from the start. And one really key thing that people weren't really expecting is that the Air Force recently confirmed that it has already built and flown a full-scale prototype of, well, at least one of the NGAD programs or one of the NGAD systems. And this is a really big deal. One idea behind this program is to return the U.S. to more of a rapid, small lot production concept, right? So a plane like the Nighthawk, what was it, F-117, basically that really angular early stealth plane that had all these sort of like jagged, dark angles. It was produced very rapidly. This was a plane that was shot down over Kosovo, but it was a very early stealth bomber type plane, very secretive for a long time, very effective, very cool for its time, whatever. The point of this plane is that it was actually developed, or at least in this context, the point of this plane was that it was developed very rapidly and it was produced in a small lot. I think there was only 10, 15, 20, 50, something like that, something in that range of the plane ever produced, but it was done very quickly and then the military moved on. That is something the military is rapidly trying to figure out with this next generation air dominance program. It wants, like I said, a whole family of systems, but it also doesn't want, well, it doesn't want to be stuck building the same system it conceived in 2020, 2018 in 2038. It's trying to figure out how do you build a large system of planes, a whole family of planes, while keeping them all up to date and interoperable and advancing the state-of-the-art technology as you do it. Because the problem today is that China in particular makes it a very bad idea to have some design for your plane that comes together around 2018 or whenever they were deciding it, 2015, 14, however long this has been in the works. This to just create the whole requirements and make the plane and sort of get it online by 2035 when China will have already seen what it is. They'll have done the corporate espionage, they'll have done the industrial espionage to find out what it is and find ways to counter it. You can't really move that slowly, and you can't be that, well, non-dexterous, right? You have to be able to shift and adapt, make new planes, make old planes. You can't just be wedded to this old system, right? That's a big problem with the F-35. It is just something that even though you're getting rapid production and mass production, you are now also wedded to an old system. And the U.S. military wants the entire aviation space to go back to, obviously this is quite optimistic and probably never going to happen, but it wants to go back to a different era where there was many manufacturers and there was an ability to make small lots of planes, have them be really good, really cool, end that production line, have a good amount of interoperability between these planes, a good amount of parts that are the same, a good amount of systems that are the same, and then to move on to another slightly better version, right? So if you can't do agile hardware development, right, you can't actually do agile hardware development in a lot of ways. You can't do for software, you just update software and then you fork it and you start working on it and you add a little thing, you throw it back to the main branch and you keep going this way and you keep spiraling up and adding new features and replacing old ones. It's much easier to do with software. You can't really do that the same way with hardware. It's much, much harder. It's much more expensive. And it's especially difficult in the military context. We have all these changing requirements, the military in a lot of ways is a lot like a home contractor or a home owner, a future homeowner that is buying a home from some contractor and then just is constantly making these changes to what it wants, right? It's a big reason the military has enormous problems trying to do any major acquisition program. It always changes what it wants because it sees new technologies, new threats, new capabilities, and it's trying to always stay ahead of them or stay ahead of all this. And it often leads to just gargantuan waste, gargantuan failures, and also gargantuan cost increases and time increases, right? So that's all a really bad thing. And the way you move to this rapid, more agile and dexterous production is probably still under debate, right? If you want to move to this, if you want to make just small lots of planes, well, then these planes aren't going to last very long. You're not going to be able to do the same cost-effective maintenance after 15 or so years. It'll get more costly, but maybe you just don't do that. Maybe you plan to have these planes that won't last as long as they have traditionally in the United States. So that's another big change that's going on where the U.S. military in general, as the lethality of the Chinese military is becoming extremely clear, the U.S. military has decided that it can no longer entirely rely on really high-end, exquisite, but vulnerable and limited weapon systems, specifically bombers, even tankers, but also bombers, and particularly all these jets, right? These tactical jets, it can't just rely on ones that are just going to be really vulnerable, right? And then you lose them, and it's very hard to replace them. That's a big problem. So the U.S. military is really interesting in something called attritable aircraft, where basically attrition is like a war of attrition, is where a lot of people are dying and everyone's sort of unfortunately getting slaughtered, and we're just seeing who's going to win this war, who's going to be able to take more of these losses, right? And in general, a war against China is much more of you're going to lose a lot of your equipment and soldiers sort of war than the U.S. has conceived of in a very long time, where this idea that you're going to have to see some attrition of your major weapon systems, this is forcing a major change in how the U.S. military is conceiving of its force structure and also the production system that creates that force, right? So the idea of having attritable aircraft is to have aircraft that are cheaper than typical aircraft and that you can afford to lose because of their cheaper price, and also they're probably unmanned and they're not even designed to last as long, right? So they're not designed to last 30 years. They're designed to last 5, 10, but you can afford to lose them. You can produce them rapidly. They can be very useful when you need to surge military power into a certain theater or contest in general. And that is it could be extremely, extremely useful. And right now, a big program in the U.S. military and also U.S. allies, particularly Australia, is the idea of basically manned, unmanned teaming. So you're going to take these classic tactical jets, like let's say the F-35, and you're going to add basically loyal wingmen. You're going to add these drones that can be controlled from these planes that will be cheaper, and they'll be able to add additional capabilities to a strike force that is using them, right? So you'll have one F-35, for example, and like 2, 3, or 5 F-35s and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, who knows how many additional loyal wingmen that are flying with them in formation. It could do different things from reconnaissance to targeting to firing, shooting. You can do all sorts of things with these aircraft, and like the idea of the whole next generation air dominance family of systems, these attritable aircraft, these unmanned attritable aircraft, are something that is already opening up that whole suite of surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting, and the idea of coordinated assaults and distributed lethality and distributed sensors. All of this is extremely, extremely important. And one way we're really seeing it is in these attritable aircraft, and most likely these aircraft are part of this whole next generation air dominance program, because a main trend in the U.S. military, in the way it's going to keep the F-35 in particular very relevant and useful, is to team it with a bunch of unmanned fighters. So that's really important, and it's also much cheaper for sustainment, which is that question, right? Why are you spending so much money on a plane if you think you're going to be in a war with a country that's going to force you to lose a lot of planes, and you might then never have to pay all those sustainment costs in the first place? You're not getting planes that you're going to even expect to last for 30 years, right? In a major war, in World War II, for example, the U.S. didn't expect all of its planes to last for 30 years of peaceful sustainment out in various bases in the middle of the country. That's not how they're starting to see things in a potential war with China. That is also not how things would likely happen in a major war with China. So that is some of what's going on. And one of the key metrics to look at, and the military is increasingly having to look at, is the cost of the effect they're looking for, right? So they're basically looking for the most efficient cost per effect, right? So if you need to take out a radar station, maybe you just send a bunch of really cheap drones to do it that are like $5-10 million, and you send them there, and even if you lose 6 of them, but you get the job done, that's great, and it's cheaper than sending 5, at this point, $80 million-ish F-35s, right? There's a whole calculus to the use of military equipment based on what they cost, how many there are, how much you can replace them, how all of that is really important. And now, as the United States is preparing to compete more and more with a country that has the industrial capacity to build large numbers of aircraft, you also can't be in a position where the United States is unable to replenish a deteriorating, or basically a military fleet or military stockpile that is facing attrition, right? That's actually being lost in combat. If you have all these planes you can't mass produce, there's a whole problem to that, right? You're going to run out of planes, and if your country you're competing with can produce them, that is a big problem, right? So, not saying that is actually the case with the U.S. and China. There's something different going on, but China is, again, driving all of this. Like I said, the F-35 does not do a lot of extremely threatening things to China. It's way better to have it than not have it. But like I said, it doesn't tip the scales really in the U.S.'s direction. And a lot of the systems China is investing in, they're investing in systems that make, in the coming years, the F-35 even less useful, right? And particularly all the systems for its anti-area access, anti-denial, area access and area access, A2AD, whatever the thing is, area access. Anti-access and area denial capabilities. There we go. Anti-access and area denial strategy. That is why we have NGAD, right? So this strategy was born, this new weapon system was in part born because China's anti-access and area denial strategy in the Western Pacific and the South China Sea is increasingly successful and dangerous, and it's growing more so. So that is why you needed this new program. And the B-21 is also a major part of this, right? So the B-21 is a bomber that, unlike this more secretive next generation air dominance, the B-21 is a bomber that is a strategic bomber, so it can go very far. This bomber was actually developed with a requirement, and it's being built, and it's going to be built to that spec, and it's going to be, again, more like a traditional weapons program, which, again, a lot of this stuff with the next generation air dominance, it may end up just looking way more like a more traditional program than we have actually been talking about right now. But in general, this is the trend, the fancy in the military community right now, and even the imagination about what they're conceiving of the next generation and air dominance program being is giving a very good indication of what many people see as necessary or see as the future of a lot of these potential future combat scenarios and the systems that will be needed to succeed in them. So the B-21 is also a part of this. So like I said, the idea of all that open systems and all of that's a big part of it. And the B-21 is actually already embodying that, right? So it is an open systems architecture. It can be manned or unmanned, and it is almost certainly seen as a key node in the whole future air wing that the Air Force is conceiving of. And what's also very interesting is that it's also building, the Air Force has also already built 5 or has 5 of these B-21s in production, and it's January of 2022 right now. And that is a rapid rate, and that is unlike what was seen for a lot of earlier programs, where there's a much longer, earlier development phase, and then you sort of move into a more hardware-rich production phase. This is happening much sooner on the B-21 program. It's almost certainly a sign that it's using many of the exact things that we were talking about in the beginning, when we were talking about what the Next Generation Air Dominance program is about. And part of what's going on is that the whole idea of bombers and fighters and all these things, as the whole military, particularly the air component of the military, has shifted more and more towards this multi-role concept, because it just makes all these planes more useful. The boundaries and borders between many different types of aircraft are just shifting and changing. And when you're in a real war, you actually don't have the luxury of having all these really defined lines. So, for example, one of the rather big Air Force programs is to basically turn its transport fleet into basically more combat aircraft by basically just dropping missiles out of the back of it. Same way you drop, cargo, they're going to drop a big pallet of, a big rack of 6 or 9 missiles out of a C-130 or whatever, and they drop it out of it, and then it has a big parachute, and it just starts dropping missiles before falling, right? And the missiles go off and they go launch towards their target. And that is actually the sort of thing you'll probably see, because you just need the effects. You need the military power whenever and wherever you need it, and however you can get it. So the fact that you can get it, you just need it however you can get it, is a big change. So in the naval context, this is why basically every ship seems like it's just getting as many missiles as possible. Just put missiles on everything, right? Put big missiles on a tiny little rubber inflatable boat, or that's basically where things are going. Because if you have a world where, my little tugboat here with its missiles can access the sensors of some other really advanced heavily radar equipped destroyer way over there, and I can launch the missile, it'll just do the whole targeting. You just want as many missiles as possible. You want them everywhere. And so China really showed how necessary this was, and really started a lot of this, because it's just been putting missiles everywhere as part of that anti-access area denial strategy, which, by the way, that is a U.S. military interpretation of the Chinese strategy, and it's one that the U.S. military has used when it's conceiving of how it should be creating and moving forward its operational concepts, but it isn't actually necessarily exactly the way China has seen it, which is an important thing I should probably get into in a different video. But nonetheless, it's sufficiently high resolution for the military to make appropriate, or begin to take appropriate countermeasures and stuff like that against that whole strategy. But getting back to the B-21, how it relates to the overall NGAD program, this is slightly different because a strategic bomber is a rare beast, right? So people may not know, but there's only 3 countries at this point that actually have what used to be called strategic bombers. Basically, big bombers that can go long distances, right? They can do basically intercontinental bombing. That is what the U.S. pioneered during World War II, when it sent hosts of planes over to Europe to bomb, and also to Japan. Less so, because the Pacific is so big once more, but into Europe in particular, to just bomb everything in Germany. It was called strategic bombing. It actually really wasn't that effective, but it was nonetheless, we got the name. And the idea of the U.S., which is in a different continent, doing strategic bombing, intercontinental bombing, has a real basis in the U.S. military's fundamental strategy, and it's a key part of U.S. military doctrine. But really, there's only 3 countries, U.S., Russia, and China, that even can do this, right? That even have bombers that can go that far. It's a very rare capability, and it's a very useful one for the U.S. military. So it actually really, really did need a specific bomber, and it needed scale in these bombers, because the U.S. bomber fleet is very old, and it's very bizarre and sort of almost cobbled together at this point. It has a lot of weird old planes. I mean, the B-52, the classic B-52, was built in the 1950s, and it's a great plane or whatever. It's going to go probably till the 2050s, but right, you probably should get something different if your plane is that old. So that is the key for it. But in general, the whole integration of the B-21 and the F-35 and these new next generation air dominance platforms, particularly in the Air Force, but also in the Navy, this is all a very big deal. And the idea is that the same way you see 5 B-21s already in various stages of production, the goal is that this next generation air dominance program moves far faster than the F-35 or than other programs, and hopefully can succeed in the ashes of the F-35, learn from its failures, and start to bring in major manufacturers. So big reason this is so important is it's going to give, it's so important for the U.S. industrial base, it's going to start giving more work, major work, to major manufacturers. So at this point, it's basically Boeing and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin will all be involved in this program. They're all going to be building systems, and they're all going to be building systems that are open systems for the other military contractors that don't do full tactical jets, but that also can, right, compete for the various subsystems and for upgrades and all of that. It is a big change, and the idea is not only will it improve the U.S. air wing, basically, but it'll also open up more work to more manufacturers and to hopefully new manufacturers, and to just increase the capacity and the flexibility and the skill of basically of the U.S. Aerospace industrial base in a really major way. And this is, in a lot of ways, needed. The whole idea of the F-35 actually was to make it this large international program that was binding other countries to U.S. security, basically U.S. weapon systems and U.S. security policies. And that was a strategic move, and it did many things that is actually very good for many countries in a lot of ways. But the whole next generation air dominance program is conceived in a very different way. This isn't going to other countries. Other countries are going to get the F-35, which they're already getting. So they're going to get the second best U.S. military defense article in the aerospace sector. And then the really good stuff is going to stay with the United States and maybe go to really close allies like it's pretty dicey at this point. They're probably not going to any other countries. The likely ones would probably be Japan, but they didn't get the F-22, so they're probably not going to get this. Although back then when they wanted to buy it, China wasn't as big a threat. So as you got Japan, you got the United Kingdom, which really doesn't need these sorts of things in the first place. It isn't useful, unfortunately, for the United Kingdom. In most of the conflicts that are coming, it's mostly a naval way that they're useful, and that's kind of different. So them, and then obviously Australia, maybe Singapore, or countries like these, but it's pretty unlikely. So this whole next generation air dominance is much more U.S. focused. It is a program that has really been created and probably really got accelerated, in particular during the Trump administration, when the U.S. had really formally and loudly and brusquely moved into being a much more protectionist and nationalist sort of country. The entire idea of the F-35 is really in the rearview mirror, just this entire international coalition. Oh, let's build parts of the plane in England, and you can manufacture yours in Japan, all that kind of stuff. This is a different world now. So the idea is actually to strengthen the industrial base that partially suffered in the 1990s. Well, obviously it was building massive amounts of stuff that was supposed to be used to fight the Soviet Union, which had disappeared. So you needed to, kind of like after World War II, there was a massive drawdown in the military. There was a very similar thing in the 1990s. In the recent corporate context, that meant huge consolidation. But that has also produced extreme vulnerabilities and weaknesses that the F-35 program in particular, that brought everything to that one manufacturer and kind of shut out the other ones, that has created huge problems. So the F-15EX program, not F-35, the F-15EX is a Boeing plane, and that's another reason that it's being used, is the U.S. military is very concerned about actually maintaining the ability of more than one company to build these planes. If you're in a situation where you need lots of planes, like I said, you need that. You actually really, really need that. And a good reason, a major way that this is actually expanding is actually the unmanned aircraft, where you have smaller, newer companies like Kratos that can make really effective aircraft that can do very useful things, but they're not also needed to build all the much more complex and difficult stuff that goes into some of the manned fighters. And so that's a big way the U.S. military can start to expand these systems. And the next generation air dominance is almost certainly going to have many, many versions of unmanned aircraft that are going to be very useful and that don't always have to be built by the big three, and that hopefully can start to expand and grow this industrial workforce and this industrial plant in the military context. So that's a big thing. And the last thing I'll say on this is just that there's also a problem. There's a weird thing in a lot of this defense procurement, this whole defense industry, where you're basically buying these planes up front, and all the manufacturers kind of get deals on the planes, right? So all the governments get deals, right? So let's say that U.S. sells F-35s to Finland, right? Well, they got a cheaper price. You're trying to beat out your competitors in this open competition, typically. So you're trying to beat out the French plane, trying to beat out a Swedish plane, all this kind of stuff. And you often need to get the price low. So how do these manufacturers make their money? Well, they make a lot of their money. And throughout aviation, they do this, including in the commercial area. They make a lot of their money in aftermarket stuff, after sale stuff, where you're basically sustaining a plane, you're upgrading a plane, you're doing maintenance, you're doing operational stuff to assist a plane. All this kind of stuff is where the money really comes in. And in general, around 15 years for any new aircraft, military aircraft in particular, you start to have massively increasing costs every year to sustain the aircraft, right? To keep it flying without anything breaking. It's around that time where maybe this will change in the future. We'll be able to make even better planes that'll last 20 before this time. But right now, you hit 15 years, you just start to pay insane costs to keep these planes flying. And that is the major reason why the F-35 costs so much. The trillion-dollar price you see, a lot of this is just sustaining these planes for decades and decades. It's not actually producing them. It really isn't. Even if you produce them, right, they're 80, 100, whatever million, that doesn't get you to $1 trillion. $1 trillion is an enormous number. It comes from decades of sustainment costs. And one of the better things the NGAD program is hoping to do is to try and nip some of this at the bud, maybe make some really root changes to slow and outdated military procurement processes, which are really old. In a lot of ways, they're from like the 50s and 80s, 90s. They're not the best. They're not what you want when you're keeping up with a near-peer competitor and potential threat. It is very different. So one way to think about it, and the thing I'm going to end on, is just think about rockets, right? Before SpaceX was in the whole industry, it was all these old, slow, expensive rockets, and things weren't improving. You weren't getting new technology. You weren't getting anything. One thing the Air Force is hoping for is that this whole next generation air dominance program can maybe do for the military, for military jets, what the Falcon 9 did for a lot of this rocket transportation, right? You got huge improvements. You got better capabilities. You got cheaper costs, and you got legitimately new innovative technologies that are transforming how things are done in that sector. That is what the U.S. military is hoping for, and it's hoping that this next generation air dominance program succeeds where the F-35 has failed, and can hopefully replace it. And in some way or other, they won't actually tell the U.S. A lot of manufacturers and people are really into that yet, but that's the goal: replace a lot of the F-35 in coming decades, and make a big and major shift to the U.S. industrial base, while making the U.S. military just more and more competitive against China, and giving it that decisive edge that deters conflict and that secures U.S. interests, and also bolsters key U.S. alliances in nations that are always wondering if the U.S. is really going to help them or not. So I hope you enjoyed this video on the Next Generation Air Dominance Program. You should definitely check out the program, see the news, see what's happening with it, because you'll learn a lot. You now have kind of a ground plan for what things should look like and what to look for. But that'll be really useful, because this will be this will be the main fun secret program people are watching for in the military. Like there's always, for every decade, there's always been those programs that people are like, oh God, what's this secret program? Is there some Aurora secret bomber? Is there some secret high flying whatever? So this is going to be a big one. What is or isn't a part of this program is what people are going to be wondering for next 5-6 years. So get ready for it. And thanks for watching. If you like this video, like it. If you like the channel, subscribe. If you really like it, check out turn on notifications, and you won't miss a single